On his graduation day, my grandson stood in front of his friends and said, "My grandpa didn't really build anything. He just worked with his hands." He said it like it was a weakness, like building with your hands wasn't building at all. They laughed. I smiled, but inside, something cracked. It wasn't the first time I'd felt invisible. But this felt like erasure. I was there, 3 rows behind, wearing the only suit I owned, the one my wife once said made me look like a senator. I had shaved. I had polished my shoes. I even brought the old camera I used when his father was his age. I sat there thinking maybe, just maybe, he'd mention me. A thank you, a nod, anything. Instead, he erased me. That evening back at the house, they threw a small family dinner. Nothing fancy. Store-bought cake, pizza, balloons that already sagged. I was handed paper plates to set out, and then forgotten in the kitchen while they took photos in the living room. When I walked in, holding a stack of napkins, I heard it again, sharper this time. "Grandpa didn't really build anything," he said, biting into his slice. "He just did plumbing and stuff." This time it wasn't just teenagers who laughed. Even his father, my own son, chuckled. "Hey," he added, "at least he kept the toilets working." The room burst into laughter. I stood still, napkins trembling in my hand. Nobody noticed. Nobody apologized. Nobody looked at me. My wife would have said something. She would have placed her hand on mine, looked at me like she used to, like I was more than the silence they gave me. But she wasn't there anymore. Cancer had taken her 3 winters ago, right before we were going to finally take that trip to the coast. Since then, I had learned to live in the quiet. But that night, the quiet screamed. I sat at the far end of the table. No one filled my cup. No one asked me stories. When the candles were lit for the cake, I clapped softly. Not for him, but for the boy I once held with calloused hands, in a room I built with borrowed tools and unpaid overtime. He didn't look at me once, not even when I left the room, and not even when I quietly closed the door behind me, napkins still in my hand. They said I built nothing, but they're standing on what I made. They just never looked down to see it. Friends, let me pause here for just a moment. Would you mind sharing in the comments? Where are you listening from? And have you ever experienced something like this in your own life? If this story touches something in you, please consider subscribing and sharing this video with others. That's how you help us grow this channel and keep telling these stories that matter. Now let's continue. He looked at me like I belonged in a museum, not one of those grand halls with marble busts and golden plaques. No, more like the corner of a dusty exhibit, something forgotten, outdated, silent. The next morning, he scrolled through his phone as I entered the kitchen, didn't look up, didn't say good morning, just sat there, headphones in, a half smile on his lips as if the world existed inside that screen. I poured my coffee slowly, the way I always did, hoping maybe the scent or the clink of the spoon might remind him I was human. It didn't. I used to carry him on my shoulders. He once grabbed my fingers with his whole hand. He used to sit beside me in the garage while I worked, asking questions about the tools, the wires, the blue lines on the paper. I remember the first time I let him hold a wrench. His tiny hands fumbled, but he smiled like he had just been given a crown. Back then, I was a giant to him. Back then, he thought I could fix anything. But boys grow up, and sometimes when they grow, they don't just outgrow their shoes. They outgrow the stories that built them. He sees sleek buildings now, glass towers with mirrored walls. He sees architects in suits, CEOs in polished shoes. He doesn't see the men who buried their hands in cement, who worked before sunrise so people could live in light, who came home with dust in their lungs and ache in their bones, not to be thanked, but to be told they missed dinner. I remember the nights I'd come home after working a double shift under a highway bridge. My wife would hand me a plate she'd kept warm, and I'd sit quietly on the back porch, shoes off, socks wet from concrete spray, hands blistered. But I never complained, because what I was building wasn't just roads or systems. I was building a life, a future, a name that would one day give shelter to the next generation. I thought he'd know, thought he'd understand that just fixing pipes meant keeping families warm. That just laying foundations meant children could run safely on sidewalks I once poured with trembling arms. But no, to him I'm the background noise in a room full of voices louder than truth. I'm the man with wrinkled knuckles and stories no one listens to. And still, I show up. Still refill the bird feeder outside his window. Still check the faucet that drips when no one remembers. Still tighten the screws on the old railing because I know one day someone will lean on it. Maybe not him. Maybe not now. But someday, because I didn't build for applause. I built so they'd never feel what I once did. The cold of not having enough. The shame of being overlooked. I built so they could forget struggle. And maybe that's the irony. They did forget. And now they look at me with eyes that don't know. The room stayed quiet, in that loud, suffocating kind of way. The kind of silence that doesn't offer peace. Only echoes. When my grandson mocked me at dinner, I waited for someone, anyone, to say something. Not to defend me like a hero. Just to speak truth. To remind him of who I was, of what I had given. But my son, his father, just kept cutting his steak. As if he hadn't once ridden in the back of a pickup I rebuilt from scrap. As if he hadn't watched me come home covered in mud, soaked from rain just to be sure he had new shoes for school. He didn't look up. Didn't flinch, just said with a chuckle, "Well, Dad's always been a hands-on guy." The kind of comment that dances on the edge of insult, dressed as casual. And his wife, my daughter-in-law, gave that polite smirk women give when they want to be liked by everyone, even at the cost of dignity. She looked at me the way people look at old wallpaper, familiar, easy to ignore, a little embarrassing. No one remembered the years I worked 3 jobs. That I missed anniversaries, birthdays, even my own father's funeral, because a pipeline broke in the middle of winter, and I was the only one who knew how to fix it. Because the city called, and I answered, every time. But at that table, none of that mattered, because to them, legacy had to sparkle. It had to come in glass frames, business cards, magazine features, not calluses. I sat there, my fork untouched, my appetite gone. The laughter faded, and the conversation moved on. To phones, new restaurants, some politician's mistake. But I wasn't listening anymore. I was watching my son, the boy I once carried on my back through a snowstorm, the boy I taught to ride a bike, who cried when he broke his arm and held onto my sleeve at night when the thunder scared him. Now a man nodding along as his own son chipped away at the bones of the man who built the roof over his head. My heart didn't break loudly. It fractured quietly, like old wood under pressure, and then I felt it, a soft squeeze. My wife's hand under the table wrapping around mine, warm, steady. She didn't speak. She didn't have to, because she knew. She had seen every missed meal, every bleeding knuckle. Every hour I stayed up drawing plans under dim light just to get it right for the city that never knew my name. She had been there the day they said the new bridge had passed inspection, the one I spent 2 winters under, welding steel in winds that froze my fingertips. She had seen the letter I never framed, from the mayor, thanking the unseen builders. She knew, so she held my hand, not in comfort, but in silent alliance. And in that gesture, I didn't feel forgotten. I felt known by the only person who ever really watched the whole story play out. The room talked. The plates clinked. The wine flowed. But nothing meaningful was said. Not about effort. Not about sacrifice. Not about what it means to give your life to something, and then fade into the background of your own legacy. They moved on. But I stayed still. Because sometimes pain doesn't scream. It just sits across the table, wearing your son's face. That house. It wasn't just a structure to me. It was a promise. A sacrifice written in cement, wire, and sleepless nights. Every brick had a story. Every corner held a memory I paid for. Not with money alone, but with time, exhaustion, and pieces of myself I'll never get back. I still remember the day the land was cleared. The lot was nothing but weeds and dust. I stood with the contractor and said, "I'll handle the foundation myself." They laughed politely. But when the first rain came and the earth turned to mud, I was the only one knee-deep in it, pouring, measuring, leveling. It took me 3 months to finish what others do in 2 weeks. Because I didn't rush. Because I knew this would be their home. I worked night shifts at the plant, then came straight to the site. I missed family picnics, football games, birthdays. They told me, "Dad, you're working too hard." But I had seen too many roofs leak in my childhood. I wasn't about to let that happen again. Not under my watch. Not for my son. Not for his children. And when it was finally done, when the doors opened and the smell of fresh wood filled the air, I handed them the keys with a smile. Not a ceremony, no speeches. Just a father saying, "It's yours now." And I meant it. I didn't put my name on the deed. I didn't want thanks. Didn't want credit. Because back then, I believed in something deeper than ownership. I believed in family. I thought that kind of giving would be remembered not in ink, but in the heart. But that night, after the dinner, sitting alone on the back porch, I started to wonder. Was I wrong? I looked at the beams above me, the ones I'd hoisted with a slipped disc in my back, the tiles under my feet, laid one by one when I could barely feel my knees. And the windows, triple paned because I remembered how cold his room used to get when he was a boy. None of it had my name. Not legally, not in the stories they told. They called it their house. They bragged about renovations I paid for, talked about modernizing it, tearing out walls I once put up with trembling hands and prayers for enough nails. It felt like watching someone repaint a portrait you bled into. I kept telling myself, love doesn't need a signature. But that night, I felt erased. Not just overlooked, undone. I had built this house so they could rest. So they could feel proud. So they would never know the shame I once knew. Of sleeping in a shed with a leaky roof. Eating bread with sugar when meat ran out. I gave them comfort. And in return, they gave me absence. Not once had they said, this was built by him. Not once had they said, he gave more than he had. Not once had they looked at the ground and remembered whose hands touched it first. I stared out into the yard I planted, the one where my grandson now plays without thinking, the swing hanging from the old oak, the stones leading to the tool shed, all mine. But not mine, because I never claimed the house. I claimed the people, and maybe they were never mine to claim. In the quiet of my study, where the light spills softly through aged curtains, and the air smells faintly of paper and time, there sits a folder. It's nothing special to look at. A faded blue cover, the corners bent, edges curled from years of being moved, untouched, then left again. Most people wouldn't even notice it. But I know exactly where it is. Second shelf, tucked between old manuals and a broken tape measure I keep for reasons I can't explain. That folder holds pieces of my life no one ever asks about. Blueprints, permits, letters, not from family, but from the city. Thank yous scrawled in rushed handwriting. Robert A. Bennett, structural supervisor, always in small print, always at the bottom of the page. They were from a time when my name meant something to people who never met me. When I walked into rooms and men in hard hats paused, not out of fear, not out of respect for rank, but because they knew I'd done the math. They knew if I said, don't pour yet, they listened, because I didn't guess. I calculated. I cared. The hospital wing, the east one where newborns take their first breath, I helped reinforce the beams. The civic bridge that cuts across Elm Creek, I spent 2 summers beneath it, soaked to the skin, welding steel with frost on my eyelashes. And the library, the one with the mural of the city's history, the foundation had to be redrawn 3 times because of the underground spring. I found it. I fixed it. But none of it has a plaque with my name, because back then, you didn't build for recognition. You built because something had to stand. And when it stood, you walked away, quietly, proudly, humbly, and the world moved forward, never turning back to ask who made it possible. That folder holds it all. The weight of a lifetime measured in sheets of graphite sketches and dry approval stamps. But no handprints on walls, no signatures etched in bronze. Just a record, a whisper. Sometimes I wonder what would happen if I left it out on the table. If my grandson opened it and saw the initials in the corner of every page, would he recognize the handwriting? Would he understand the calculations, the pressure points, the sleepless nights behind every line? Or would he shrug? Another folder, another life too far behind him to matter. When I was younger, I used to think the folder was something I'd show my son someday. I imagined sitting with him, pointing out the first permit I received when I was just 23, telling him about the mistakes I almost made, the ones I caught just in time, the bridge that almost failed, until I said, check the soil again, and they did. The contractor that quit, the team I led through 2 strikes, the night I slept in the back of my truck just to make deadline. But I never showed it. Because life kept moving, because he stopped asking, because I got tired of starting stories that ended in silence. And so the folder sat, year after year, becoming less of a record and more of a secret. Until that night, after the dinner, after the laughter at my expense, I opened it again. Not to brag, not to prove anything, just to remember that it was real, that I wasn't imagining the life I had lived, that even if they forgot, I hadn't. I ran my hand over the first blueprint. The paper had yellowed, but my notes in pencil were still clear, precise, neat, deliberate, like I was, like I had been. I didn't cry. Not then. But I sat in that chair for hours, reading every sheet like a man reading his own name for the first time in years. And when I closed the folder, I placed it gently back on the shelf, not out of shame, not to hide, but because I knew one day someone would find it, and maybe then they'd finally see what I built. Not just with tools, but with silence, and devotion, and years, so many years. I arrived at the school gym just as the lights flickered on, the scent of cheap punch and styrofoam plates hanging in the air. Parents milled about, clutching raffle tickets and paper napkins, voices blending into a soft roar. My grandson stood at the front, microphone in hand, cheeks flushed with excitement. He cleared his throat and glanced back at me, once so full of that eager light, and then turned to the crowd. "This is my grandpa," he said, voice bright as a bell. "He used to be something." A ripple of laughter spread through the room, not the polite kind that greets a harmless joke, but the sharp, curious kind that hunts for stories in someone's eyes. I felt the heat rise in my face, a dull burn that spread down my neck, and I tucked my hands into the pockets of my worn jacket. My heart pounded in my chest like a hammer against steel. He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. The laughter did his work for him. He pivoted on his heel, leaving me standing alone by the coat rack, a sea of coats and scarves, heavier than any building I'd ever worked on. Parents turned back to their friends, resumes and career highlights already forgotten, their attention shifting like the sands of time. I looked down at the scuffed floor, at the single coat hook where I'd hung my jacket. In that moment, the walls I'd built in my life, walls of concrete and stone, walls of sacrifice and sweat, felt more fragile than this flimsy cinderblock gym. I remembered summers pouring foundations under blistering sun, winters shivering through drafts in half-finished houses, all to give my family a place to belong. Yet here, in this room bright with fluorescent lights, I belonged to nothing more than a punchline. I closed my eyes and inhaled the stale air, tasting memories instead of mint. I pictured the bond I once had with this boy, teaching him to hammer nails, showing him how to read plans, letting him carry the level while I held the ladder. He used to look at me as though I held the world in my hands. Now he looked away, as if deciding I no longer mattered. A teacher approached with a paper plate, offered me a slice of cake. I forced a smile, mumbled thanks, and took a bite that tasted like crumbs and regret. The knife tracks were jagged. Someone had rushed it. I thought of every project I'd rushed through the night before dawn, every deadline I'd met at the cost of my own rest, the holes in my hands that never fully healed. I set the plate aside, empty, and stood up straighter. The laughter still echoed, but I let it wash over me instead of crash against me. I brushed imaginary dust from my jacket, as if standing there made me invisible. Then I turned away from the coat rack, from the crowd that had turned a lifetime of work into a careless shrug, and walked out into the night. Outside the air was cool and clear. The stars above felt more honest than the lights inside. I inhaled deeply, letting the silence settle around my shoulders like a familiar blanket. I would not let one evening erase who I was. I would carry my name with me, etched not on any deed, but in every beam I'd set, every foundation I'd poured, every roof I'd sealed against the rain. And someday, perhaps, he'd remember what it meant, when I told him quietly, years ago, that a man builds with more than just bricks. He builds with heart. When the phone rang that afternoon, I nearly didn't answer. Old habits die hard. Voices on the line usually meant trouble or bills. But something in the way they said Mr. Bennett made me pause. The voice on the other end trembled like an old recorder, crackling through the years. "We're honoring the original project team for the city expansion," it said, words heavy with ceremony and unseen reverence. "Your name came up. Would you come speak?" I sank into the nearest chair, the one I kept for reading in the fading light. My hands, still marked by decades of work, hovered over the receiver. I thought of the dusty folder on my shelf, the yellowed pages with my name stamped in ink so long ago it had begun to fade. I thought of that silent study where no one ever bothered to ask about the projects I'd slaved over. Would I come? My first instinct was to say no, to let the past stay buried in blueprints and broken beams, to avoid another room full of strangers who'd probably clap politely and move on just as my family had. But then I imagined my grandson's face, eyes flicking past me as if I were glass, not flesh and bone. The memory stung deeper than any callous bruise I'd ever carried, and I realized I didn't need their applause. I needed him to see. So I said yes. That night, I sat by the window and watched the streetlights flicker on one by one. I traced the outline of the old bridge with my finger on the glass, the one I'd welded piece by piece through that bitter winter. I remembered the hospital wings scaffolding, the echo of steel beams, the smell of fresh mortar. I practiced my speech in whispers, not wanting the neighbors to hear. I didn't want no one knowing I still trembled at the thought of standing before an audience after all these years, but I also felt something else, an ember of pride glowing in my chest, warming the hollow, places grief had left behind. The next morning I dusted off my only suit, the one that used to feel too big, now fitting me like armor. I combed my hair until I could see a sliver of silver at my temples, a reminder that time had passed, but strength remained. I slipped the old folder into my briefcase, the one I'd ordered for retirement, but never used. Inside, I tucked the permit stamped approved on the library expansion. My first win. Driving to the city hall, I passed the sites I helped build, the park benches where children laughed, the street lamps that guided late-night walkers, the facade of the civic center that caught the sunset in its glass. I felt a quiet satisfaction, the kind that comes when you know you did something right, even if no one thanked you at the time. When they led me to the podium, the room hushed. I saw names of colleagues I'd once shared lunches with, some gone now, some older, all bearing the weight of years I understood. Then my name appeared on the screen behind me, Robert A. Bennett, honorary speaker. I cleared my throat and spoke, not of blueprints or permits, but of what lies beneath every structure. Faith in tomorrow. Hands willing to hurt if it meant helping someone else stand. I spoke of nights under streetlights, mapping beams to bear burdens they'd never know. I spoke of love, how building for family meant more than any title on a deed. When I stepped down, they applauded. I felt the rhythm of their claps echo in my chest. But it wasn't their approval I carried afterward. It was the echo of my own voice, reminding me who I was. And somewhere in that crowd, I hope my grandson heard. I called home that evening to share the news, my words trembling with anticipation. They asked me to speak at the ceremony. On the other end of the line, my son paused, mid-chew. The background clatter of dishes stopped. Then a sigh. Sounds like a nice nostalgia trip. His voice held that half-smile he uses when he wants to be polite, but keep his distance. I swallowed the lump in my throat. I pictured him folding his arms, leaning against the kitchen counter, so sure that what I'd done was yesterday's news, not tomorrow's honor. Behind him, I imagined my daughter-in-law arranging picture frames on the wall, nodding but not really listening. And my grandson, head down, eyes glued to a glowing screen, swiped through messages and memes, unaware or uncaring that his grandfather's name would soon light up in the hall where city leaders gathered. That hurt more than silence. I remembered long afternoons teaching that boy to hold a hammer, the concentrated furrow of his brow as he sank a nail straight. I remembered the pride in his small voice when he'd say, "I'm helping Grandpa build." Now he didn't even lift his head to acknowledge me. I rested the phone on my shoulder and closed my eyes, picturing our old home, the one I built from ground up, every beam and board placed with hope for their future. I thought of the nights I fell asleep at my drafting table, exhaustion pulling me under, dreams of structures yet to rise. Okay, I managed, voice soft. I just wanted you to know. They moved on to the weather forecast and plans for dinner. No congratulations, no curiosity, no spark of recognition. I hung up and stood in the quiet of my empty living room, walls echoing with memories no one else heard. The weight of disappointment settled like dust on the mantel. But somewhere beneath it all, a steadfast ember glowed, because even if they couldn't see it now, I knew, in the steel I welded, the mortar I mixed, the blueprints I signed, they would one day come to understand. And if not them, then whoever needed proof that a man's worth isn't in applause, but in the foundations he leaves behind. The day of the ceremony arrived in a haze of crisp autumn air and the steady hum of city life. I sat in the back row of folding chairs under a tent erected on the plaza I helped plan, alone among strangers dressed in dark suits and polished shoes. They spoke of vision and progress, of the hands that laid the groundwork for tomorrow's skyline. I listened as names glided past in a formal script, yet none belonged to me. They called for me to stand, to accept a plaque honoring decades of work. I rose slowly, each muscle remembering the toll of years, the ache in my shoulders from lifting steel beams, the calluses on my palms from holding rebar in freezing winds. I stepped forward, the applause polite but practiced, as if they were clapping for a story they'd only skimmed in a brochure. Behind me, a screen flickered through images, the bridge spanning Elm Creek at dawn, the library's grand facade, the hospital's quiet corridors. And I saw them, blueprints with my initials, permit stamps in my handwriting. Yet when I turned, searching among the audience, I saw empty seats where my family should have been. Not one vacant chair marked reserved or labeled with my name. No silent tribute to the man whose hands built the very ground they walked on. I swallowed the lump in my throat and spoke into the microphone. My words cracked at first, confession more than speech. I didn't build for credit, I said, voice steadying as the weight of years steadied me. I built because someone had to. Behind me, officials nodded, unaware of the deeper truth hidden in the silence of my family's absence. I finished and returned to my seat, applause following me back like an echo in an empty hall. I sat, chest tight, as the ceremony moved on to the next honoree. They lifted glossy photos of glass towers I once reinforced. I watched quietly, perched on the edge of my chair, remembering nights spent under scaffolds and dawns spent measuring footers. Through the gentle clapping and the shuffle of programs, I closed my eyes. I imagined one of those chairs pushed back, an empty space beside me meant for my son, meant for my grandson. A silent acknowledgement that legacy isn't always spoken, but sometimes reserved. When the ceremony ended, I rose again. The plaque felt heavy in my hands, metal cool against my palm. I walked past lines of officials shaking hands, cameras flashing. No one offered an escort. No one pointed me to my family's seats, because there were none. Outside, the plaza was bathed in golden light. I stood for a moment, the plaque pressed to my chest, and let the breeze carry away the ache of absence. Then I looked up at the buildings I'd helped create, their windows reflecting the sun, and I understood they would always stand, even if my family didn't have the courage to sit. I tucked the plaque under my arm and walked toward the street, carrying the weight of recognition that belonged as much to me as the empty chairs did to them. Then the screen shifted and everything stilled. A single blueprint filled the display, the city's new civic center, every line drawn in crisp, white precision against a deep blue field. My breath caught as the camera panned slowly across arches and columns I had calculated, foundations I'd reinforced against flood and quake. And there in the bottom right corner, typed in bold letters, Chief Structural Supervisor, Robert A. Bennett. The gasp rose like a tide. Hands flew to mouths. Eyes widened. I saw my grandson's phone drop from his hand, clattering against the polished floor. The officials standing on stage exchanged stunned looks, some stepping back as if they'd touched a live wire. The room that had applauded politely now leaned forward, curiosity and awe pulling them together. In that moment, the walls of recognition broke open. I felt the heat of all those years, the nights welded under half-light, the weekends spent checking beams, the silent prayers I whispered before each pour, surged through me. Faces turned, trying to find me in the crowd. My son's jaw went slack. My daughter-in-law blinked hard as if seeing me for the first time. I rose slowly, chest pounding, and walked toward the stage. Each step shook with the weight of vindication and relief. The blueprint, a testament to every blister, every sleepless calculation, glowed behind me. I realized then that true legacy isn't in quiet sacrifice alone. It's in the moment. The truth can't be hidden anymore. When I reached the podium again, I didn't speak of blueprints or titles. I spoke of all those who build in silence, whose names remain in the fine print until someone finally looks. And as applause thundered around me, I saw my grandson standing at the edge of the crowd, eyes shining with something like wonder and maybe, at last, pride. I stepped forward onto the makeshift stage again, the plaque still tucked under my arm like proof of a life lived in quieter corners. The crowd's applause softened, curiosity taking its place as they waited. I looked out at faces reflecting surprise, some tinged with embarrassment, most alight with new respect. My heart pounded, not with fear, but with the fierce clarity of a man who finally has the floor. I began without preamble, letting the blueprints glow fade behind me. I didn't build empires, I said, voice carrying across the plaza. I could feel the air shift, the way fresh wind moves through a half-closed door. But I built foundations. For children I loved more than credit. I paused, letting those words settle. Beneath the stifled chatter, I heard my grandson's breath catch. I felt my son's gaze, heavy with guilt and wonder, and I saw my daughter-in-law's face soften, as if she'd glimpsed a chapter she'd never read. I didn't stand here for glory, I continued, drawing strength from the years I'd poured into concrete and steel. I stood on waterlogged earth, in biting cold, so that parents could rest without fear of the bridge failing beneath their feet. I measured beams by the light of a single bulb, night after night, so that hospital hallways would remain strong when life itself hung in the balance. In that moment, I carried every injury, every ache, every silent sacrifice I'd ever made. I carried the blistered hands that once turned the wrench with trembling determination. I carried the hours of solitude, drafting plans no one outside my study ever asked to see. And now, I said, lifting the plaque as though offering it back to those who needed proof, I stand here to remind you that what's beneath every strong building is a man who believed in tomorrow, not for credit, not for applause, but for the simple dignity of knowing a child, any child, could walk safely on the ground I made solid. The applause rose like thunder, sweeping across the plaza. I didn't look for empty chairs or silent faces, because this time the sound was enough. The truth had found its voice, and at last it shook the room. The applause faded into a soft hum as I stepped down from the stage, plaque in hand and heart still thrumming with the resonance of every word I had spoken. Officials and strangers alike came forward, clasping my shoulder in gratitude, their eyes glistening with tears as they spoke of how my work had touched lives they barely understood. Old colleagues pressed into the circle, men and women who had exchanged late-night phone calls with me over shivering walkways and unstable scaffolds. Some wept quietly, their gratitude heavier than any medal. Their faces reflected a shared history of grit and perseverance, the unspoken bond of builders who knew what it meant to give everything without asking for more than a simple nod of recognition. Yet through that moving throng, I searched for one familiar face and found nothing. No son at my side, no daughter-in-law offering a proud smile, no grandson's eyes shining with newfound respect. The empty space beside me felt colder than any autumn breeze. I tucked the plaque under my arm and let them lead me toward the back exit, the weight of their admiration warming me even as the absence of my family pressed against my ribs like an unhealed fracture. I reminded myself that some wounds cannot be filled by polite applause, that true acknowledgment sometimes arrives long after the final echoes have died. I wandered through the crowd, allowing my mind to drift back to that dusty folder on the shelf and the blueprint slide that had changed everything. And then I saw him, my grandson, standing at the edge of the plaza, face turned toward me with eyes too old for his 19 years. He stood alone, phone forgotten at his feet, hands clenched at his sides. At that moment, his expression shifted from awkward shame to something raw and honest, understanding. He didn't step forward immediately. Instead, he watched me walk past, absorbing the atmosphere I had helped create. And in the space between us, where years of silence lingered, a quiet connection began to form, one that needed no ceremony, no slides, and no empty chairs. It simply needed truth laid bare, finally recognized. He found the pamphlet tucked beneath a stack of event programs on the cafe table, unfolded it almost carelessly, page after page of glossy photos and proud captions, and then stopped cold. The headline blazed at him, "The Man Who Held This City Up." His eyes flicked to the picture, a steadfast face framed by silver hair, eyes that had once been mirrors of his own childhood laughter. And beneath it, in crisp type, 3 words he had never expected to see: Robert A. Bennett. In that pause, the world around him dimmed. The hum of conversation in the cafe, the clink of a spoon against a mug, even the soft murmur of traffic outside. Everything fell away as he stared at the name he had dismissed so casually. His heart thudded against his ribs, a sudden echo of all those nights his grandfather had spent pouring foundations before dawn, of all those afternoons teaching him to swing a hammer with both precision and love. He felt an ache that defied explanation, pride warred with regret, and shame burned with the sting of realization. He traced the letters with trembling fingertips, as though by touching the ink he might bridge the chasm of misunderstanding between them. He remembered the way Grandpa's hands had trembled when he first showed him the tools in that cluttered garage, how he'd whispered, "Remember, every beam you set carries someone's tomorrow." At the time, he'd shrugged and muttered something about just pipes, never imagining the weight those words carried. Now he saw a lifetime compressed into that pamphlet, silent sacrifices, hidden triumphs, a legacy he had too long overlooked. And in that moment, as the cafe lights blurred around him, he reached out to pull the pamphlet closer, to study every line of the blueprint that lay behind the headline, to absorb every detail of the man he'd thought was nothing more than an old guy with calloused fingers. Tears welled in his eyes, not for himself, but for the years lost in careless indifference. He realized that the greatest structures of all are built not of steel and stone, but of recognition and gratitude. Folding the pamphlet gently, he pressed it to his chest, feeling the weight of history settle there. And in that quiet reckoning, he vowed to see him differently from now on, proudly, fully, as the man who had carried an entire city on his shoulders and still found the strength to carry his family in his heart. Evenings settled over the neighborhood like a warm blanket, street lamps flickering on one by one as dusk deepened. I sat in my living room, the old armchair worn smooth where I always read, the lamp casting a golden glow over the scattered blueprints I'd kept. I was tracing the lines of the Civic Center's foundation with a finger when I heard it, a soft knock at the door, tender yet insistent. I rose slowly, the plaque tucked under my arm, and opened the door. There he stood, my grandson, hands at his sides, shoulders hunched as though carrying a weight that belonged to both of us. He held no phone, no pamphlet, just the quiet courage to stand before me. His eyes, those eyes I once knew only in laughter or impatient glare, were now wet with something deeper, remorse, respect, and an understanding that had taken too long to find its way. I stepped aside wordlessly, and he entered the living room, eyes flicking to the scattered papers, the folder on the shelf, the chair where I'd built countless dreams. I watched him swallow, the space between us electric with the words neither of us had spoken. He drew a slow breath, voice barely more than a whisper. "Grandpa, I was wrong." Time seemed to fold in that instant as he knelt before the coffee table and picked up the faded folder. He opened it with reverence, fingers brushing the blueprints as though touching a sacred text. I stood behind him, silent and steady, feeling the tremor of reconciliation ripple through my chest. His gaze lifted, meeting mine with a humility I hadn't expected. No bravado, no excuses, just the simple truth laid bare. I thought you were just the handyman," he said, voice thick with emotion. "I didn't see what you built." My heart swelled as I placed a hand on his shoulder, calloused and warm. I felt the years between us soften, the distance shrink to nothing. He closed the folder gently as though sealing a promise, and looked up at me with tears shining like stars in the fading light. In that moment, I realized that the greatest structures I'd ever built weren't in steel or stone, but in this fragile space between two hearts finding their way back. And as the night deepened outside, we stood together, grandfather and grandson no longer separated by misunderstanding, but joined by a shared legacy of truth, respect, and love. I handed him the old folder as if it were a family heirloom, its worn cover speaking of years hidden away. He took it with tentative reverence, fingers tracing the faded title, then opened it slowly, each page unfolding like sacred text. The blueprints stared back at us, lines and angles that once guided my hands, now guiding his eyes. He looked up, voice trembling. "This is what you built?" I nodded, my throat tight. The memories welled inside me. The nights I bent over these plans by lamplight, the mornings I walked the empty job site alone, whistle in hand, ensuring every measurement held true. All those moments I'd carried hope on my shoulders, believing a stronger city meant a better life for the next generation. But in his gaze, I saw something more important than steel or stone. I saw promise, potential, a future waiting to be shaped. "No," I said softly, voice breaking like fine concrete under pressure. "You are." His eyes widened, and for a heartbeat, the room held its breath. Then he closed the folder, a newfound determination settling in his shoulders. He met my gaze with a strength I'd never given him credit for. "I understand now." Outside, the night wind rustled the leaves, carrying the quiet pulse of a city built on foundations both seen and unseen. Inside, grandfather and grandson stood together, bound by more than blood, bound by a shared truth that real legacy isn't in what you leave behind, but in who you inspire. I reached out and placed my hand on his, heart full. "And now," I whispered, "you get to build the rest." In that moment, the old folder wasn't just a record of my life's work. It was a passing of the torch, a real blueprint for a future they would craft together, brick by brick, heart by heart.